My son texted me early that morning. I was standing by the front door, jacket on, small bag packed, keys already in my hand. The house was quiet, morning light coming through the window like it always did. The phone buzzed. I looked down. The message said, "Don't come to the airport, my wife wants just family." That was it, no explanation, no follow-up, no apology. I read it once, then I locked the screen. I didn't reply, I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't call. I set the keys down on the table, took the jacket off, and walked back into the house. Outside, the day kept moving. Cars passed. Somewhere nearby, a plane lifted off. The airport was already busy, just without me in it. I sat down at the kitchen table. My name's Daniel. I'm 65, retired. I've never been the type to argue through text messages or force myself into places where I'm clearly not wanted. When someone draws a line, I notice it. I don't step over it. I raised my son to stand on his own. I helped when he asked. I stepped back when he didn't. That balance always mattered to me. If you're listening to this right now and this kind of moment feels familiar, that's why I'm sharing it. Not for sympathy, just because these quiet situations happen more than people admit, and they change things. If you're watching this, let me know where you're tuning in from, city, state, country, just drop it in the comments. And if stories like this hit close to home, you might want to subscribe. These aren't random stories. They're the kind you recognize once you've lived long enough. That morning, I stayed home. I unpacked the bag I'd packed for the airport. Folded the clothes, put everything back where it came from. Nothing in the house looked different. Same walls, same furniture, same clock on the wall. I picked up my phone again and reread the message. My wife wants just family. Not we talked about it, not it's complicated, just that. I didn't forward it to anyone, I didn't screenshot it, I didn't explain it to myself either. I made coffee. Let it sit, reheated it later, forgot about it again. The time moved slowly after that. Late morning turned into early afternoon. No new messages, no missed calls. Whatever was happening on their end was happening without me. I stayed quiet. Sometime that afternoon, while they were still traveling, still assuming the day was going exactly as planned, I made a decision. Just one. It didn't involve an argument. It didn't involve raising my voice. And it didn't require anyone else's approval. I handled something that had been sitting quietly in the background for a long time. No announcements, no warnings. And by the time they showed up later, things were already handled. A few months earlier, the word family still felt solid, not loud, not dramatic, just understood. We didn't talk every day, my son and I, but we didn't have to. Calls were easy, short, familiar, sometimes about nothing important. Sometimes about things he didn't want to say out loud to anyone else. I never pushed, I never pried, I stayed where I was needed. Things shifted slowly after he got married. At first it was small. Plans moved around. Dinners got rescheduled. Calls came later than they used to, or not at all. When I did see them, conversations felt tighter, like there was a script I wasn't holding. I told myself that was normal. New marriage, new routines. New priorities. I adjusted without making a point of it, stopped suggesting dates, let invitations come to me instead. When they didn't, I filled my time with other things. That's what you do when you don't want to be in the way. There were moments I noticed but didn't comment on, questions that went unanswered, decisions that had already been made before I heard about them. Casual phrases like, "We'll see," or "We'll let you know," said with the tone of something already decided. I stayed quiet. Peace is easy to protect when you don't look too closely. The house was still part of our conversations back then, not directly, not officially, just casually. The way people talk about something they assume will always be there, If we ever need a place for a bit, when we come back next time, it'll be easier once everything's settled. Nothing was asked outright, nothing was offered either. It just hovered in the background like a shared understanding that didn't need to be discussed. I noticed that too. Still, I said nothing. I'd learned over the years that sometimes the fastest way to lose ground is to defend it too early. So I let things be, let assumptions sit where they were, let silence do the work. Looking back, I can see the pattern more clearly, not one big moment, not one argument. And just a series of small steps where my presence mattered a little less each time. At the time, I explained it away. They're busy, they're figuring things out, this is just how it goes. I didn't want to be the person who turned normal change into conflict, so I adjusted again and again and again. What I didn't realize then was that while I was stepping back to keep the peace, other decisions were already being made quietly, confidently, with the assumption that nothing on my end would ever change. That assumption had been forming for a while, and it had a lot to do with this house. I didn't confront it, I didn't challenge it, I just noticed. And I kept copies of things most people don't think to keep anymore. At the time, it felt unnecessary. Later, it wouldn't. It didn't happen all at once. That's the part people don't understand unless they've lived it. There was no argument, no falling out, no moment where voices were raised and lines were clearly drawn. Just a pattern that settled in quietly and stayed. Calls started going to voicemail more often. When they were returned, it was hours later, sometimes the next day, always with a casual tone like nothing had been missed. Sorry, busy, long day, we'll catch up soon. I accepted that. Plans shifted without much warning. A dinner pushed back, a weekend shortened, a visit turned into a maybe, then into nothing at all. I'd find out after the fact, not because anyone meant to exclude me, but because it was more convenient that way. That word came up a lot, convenient. It's just easier if it made more sense to. We didn't think it would matter. I told myself it didn't. I adjusted my schedule, left days open that didn't need to be open, made room for things that didn't always show up. When they did, I acted like nothing had changed. That's how you keep things smooth. There were moments, though, when something felt slightly off. Not wrong enough to challenge, just uncomfortable enough to notice. Decisions were already finalized by the time I heard about them. Trips planned, timelines set, expectations formed. My role in those decisions was minimal if it existed at all. I explained it away. They're building a life. This is how independence looks. I don't need to be involved in everything. That's what I told myself. But doubt has a way of slipping in when you're quiet long enough. It shows up in small questions you don't ask out loud. When did they stop checking first? When did my opinion become optional? When did "we'll talk about it" turn into "this is what we're doing"? I didn't confront those questions. I answered them for myself instead. It's temporary, they'll circle back, things will settle. That belief made it easier to ignore the feeling that I was being slowly edged out of decisions that somehow still depended on me, especially when it came to the house. There was one conversation that stuck with me. It happened casually, like most of them did, a passing comment about future plans, about space, about how things would be once everything lined up. The tone was confident, assumptive, not asking, not checking. Just speaking as if the answer was already known. I remember nodding along, saying very little, letting the moment pass without interrupting it. Later that night, I thought about that conversation again. Something about it didn't sit right. Not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. No questions, no details, no pause, just certainty. I didn't push back then either. I went back to what I'd been doing all along, staying quiet, keeping things normal, trusting that my silence was protecting the relationship. What I didn't realize was that silence was being read as agreement, and agreements, even unspoken ones, have consequences. I wouldn't understand how serious those consequences were until much later, when that same house, the one everyone seemed so sure about, stopped being a background detail and became something much more deliberate. The house had always been there, not as a bargaining chip, not as leverage, just there, solid, paid for, quiet, the kind of place people assumed would never change hands or terms because it never had before. It came up more often than I realized, not in direct conversations. No one ever sat down and said, "Here's what we expect." It was always framed lightly, casually, like it was already settled. "When we're back for a while, if we ever need to stay longer, it'll be easier once everything's under one roof." They spoke about it like it was a shared plan, not an owned space. I listened, I nodded, I didn't interrupt. That was my role by then. I'd catch myself noticing how comfortably they talked about timelines that didn't involve asking me, how confidently they referenced rooms, storage, access, not aggressively, just assumed. At first, I brushed it off. People talk loosely. People imagine futures that may never happen. It didn't mean anything on its own, except it kept happening. Each time the language was a little firmer, the certainty a little stronger. Less if more when I started paying attention to the details, what was said, what wasn't, and how rarely my name appeared in plans that somehow revolved around my home. I didn't correct them. Correction changes tone. And I wasn't ready to change the tone yet. Instead, I went back through old paperwork one afternoon, not with urgency, not with suspicion, just to organize things that had been sitting untouched for years. Folders, deeds, records. Copies of documents most people trust to exist somewhere else. I didn't tell anyone I was doing it. I wasn't planning anything. I just wanted clarity for myself. As I flipped through the pages, I realized how long it had been since anyone had actually looked at the details. Assumptions had filled in the gaps where facts used to live. I put everything back where it belonged, still said nothing. Around that time, my son started talking with more confidence about the future, about how things would work, about what made the most sense for everyone. That phrase stood out to me, for everyone. It sounded inclusive, reasonable. Final, but it never came with a question. No, does that work for you? No, what do you think? Just conclusions. I told myself it was normal, that families talk this way. That pushing back would only create tension where none needed to exist. I reminded myself that I'd always believed in letting people grow into their own decisions, even if those decisions brushed past me on the way. Still, something had shifted. The house was no longer just a place I lived. It had become a piece in conversations I wasn't fully part of. I noticed it, I noted it, and I kept my distance. Silence still felt like the safest option. But silence doesn't stop momentum, it just lets it build in one direction. And by the time that airport text came through weeks later, the confidence behind it hadn't come out of nowhere. It had been forming for a while, right here. The morning of the airport came and went quietly. No rush, no traffic updates playing in the background, no last-minute checks to make sure I hadn't forgotten anything. Just the sound of the house settling back into itself after I set my keys down. I kept glancing at the clock out of habit, not because I was waiting for something to change, but because my body hadn't caught up with the decision yet. For months, plans had been loose, adjustable. That morning wasn't. There was nothing to adjust. I thought about where they were at that exact moment. Boarding, finding seats, getting settled in, the small rituals that come with travel. I wasn't angry about missing it, just aware. I filled the morning with ordinary tasks, washed a cup that didn't need washing, straightened mail that was already straight, the kind of things you do when you need time but don't want to admit it. I didn't check my phone much. No messages came in. That silence confirmed something I hadn't wanted to say out loud yet. By late morning, the airport felt distant, like it belonged to another version of the day. I made lunch and ate it standing up, then sat back down at the table, not in a hurry to move on. That's when it clicked, not as a wave, not as anger, just clarity. Sometimes a single sentence is enough to show you where you stand. If you've ever had a moment like that where you stayed quiet instead of reacting, I'm curious how you handled it. Let me know in the comments, and if you're still here listening, go ahead and subscribe. Not because this is dramatic, but because stories like this tend to go where most people stop talking. Early that afternoon, I sat back down at the kitchen table again. This time, I didn't stay still. I picked up the phone and made one call, not to my son, not to anyone emotionally involved, just someone neutral. Someone whose job was to answer questions without opinions. I didn't explain the situation. I didn't mention the text. I asked practical questions. Carefully, the kind you ask when you want facts, not comfort. The answers were calm, direct. They confirmed something important. I thanked them, ended the call, and sat there quietly. Nothing in the house looked different. No boxes, no locks, no visible changes, but something had shifted. That call didn't start anything. It clarified what already existed. I didn't tell anyone I'd made it. I didn't change my tone. When my phone buzzed later with a casual update about their arrival, I replied politely. Briefly, everything looked normal, but by then, what needed to be handled already was. The call itself didn't take long, no hold music, no back and forth, just a calm voice on the other end answering exactly what I asked and nothing more. I kept my questions simple, neutral, almost boring. I didn't mention my son. I didn't mention his wife. I didn't mention the airport or the text or how that morning had landed. I asked about records, about status, about what still applied and what didn't. The answers came back just as plainly. Clear, current. Still valid. I thanked them and hung up. For a few seconds I stayed seated at the table, phone still in my hand, staring at the dark screen. Not relieved, not upset, just aware that something I'd assumed was fragile wasn't. What surprised me most wasn't the information. It was how long everyone else had been operating without it. Assumptions had replaced facts somewhere along the way. Confidence had filled the space where questions used to live. And no one had checked whether that confidence was actually supported by anything solid. I didn't feel the need to correct that right away. Corrections invite arguments. Clarity doesn't have to. I put the phone down and stood up. Walked through the house slowly, same creak in the hallway floor, same picture frames on the wall, everything still mine, still exactly where it belonged. That mattered more than I expected. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed again, a short message. A casual, an update about their arrival time, no mention of the morning, no acknowledgement of the text that had changed the direction of the day. I replied politely, "Sounds good, drive safe," nothing else. I didn't bring anything up. I didn't hint at the call, I didn't ask questions of my own. Silence at this point wasn't avoidance, it was strategy. That evening, I noticed something shift in the way my son communicated. The confidence was still there, but it felt rehearsed now, like someone sticking to a script they hadn't written themselves. There were assumptions in his words, expectations hidden inside friendly phrasing. When we get there, we'll probably it'll be easier if I didn't interrupt any of it. I listened, I acknowledged, I stayed neutral. What I didn't do was agree. That difference matters. Agreement moves things forward. Silence keeps them suspended. That night, I pulled out the folder I'd organized weeks earlier, the one I hadn't planned to use for anything specific. I didn't add anything to it. I didn't remove anything either. I just checked that everything was where it needed to be. Prepared doesn't mean aggressive, it just means ready. By then, I knew something my son didn't, not because I'd hidden it, but because he'd never thought to look. The call had confirmed more than I expected, not just legally, but relationally. It showed me how far things had drifted without anyone stopping to check the ground beneath them. I went to bed that night without sending another message. No reminders, no warnings, they were still confident, they had no reason not to be. But confidence built on assumption has a shelf life, and theirs was already running out. They arrived the next day, not quietly, not cautiously, with the same easy confidence they'd had for months. The kind that comes from believing everything is already settled. I heard the car before I saw it, tires on the driveway. Doors opening and closing, familiar footsteps approaching the house like nothing had changed. I opened the door and greeted them normally. No tension, no coldness, no mention of the airport. Hugs were brief, polite. Conversations stayed light, travel talk, traffic, small complaints about the drive. Everything sounded rehearsed, like we were all playing our parts and no one wanted to break character. They moved through the house comfortably, too comfortably. Bags were set down without asking where. A jacket hung over a chair like it already belonged there. Casual comments about what room would be used for what, spoken like reminders instead of questions. I listened, I nodded. I didn't correct anything. My son spoke confidently about the next few days, about plans, about how things would work while we're here. Each sentence assumed access, time, and permission without ever saying the words. His wife didn't say much at first. When she did, it was efficient, direct, practical. It'll be easier if we keep things simple. We won't need much, we'll just do it this way. There was no hostility in her voice, just certainty. I stayed calm, answered when spoken to, didn't volunteer extra information. When questions came, they were framed to guide the answer, not invite discussion. I noticed that too. At dinner, the tone shifted slightly, nothing obvious. Just a little impatience when I didn't immediately confirm a plan, a pause that lingered a second longer than it needed to, a glance between them when something didn't land the way they expected. Confidence doesn't disappear all at once, it frays. Later that evening, my son asked a question that caught my attention. Not directly, not clearly, just a casual check-in disguised as conversation. "So everything's still good here, right?" The way he said still told me everything. I met his eyes and nodded, of course. That answer wasn't a lie, it just wasn't the answer he thought it was. After they went to bed, I sat alone in the living room for a while. The house felt different with them in it now, not fuller, just louder. Less patient, I didn't feel rushed. What needed to happen didn't require speed, only timing. The next morning, their tone shifted again, more questions, less assumption, subtle but noticeable. "What time were you heading out today? Did you want to handle this now or later?" Small cracks. They didn't know why yet, but they could feel it. And that's when I decided it was time to stop letting the momentum carry itself forward. Not with confrontation, not with anger, just with something official, something that didn't care about feelings or tone or family dynamics. I told them I had an appointment that afternoon, nothing more. The room went quiet for a moment. Then the confidence tried to come back, but it didn't land the same way, because somewhere underneath it, unease had already started to grow. The appointment changed the air in the house, not immediately. At first, it was brushed off, a nod, a casual okay, the kind of response you give when you don't think something applies to you. But as the morning went on, the questions started. Not direct, not confrontational, just frequent. What time is it? How long will it take? Is this something we need to be around for? Each one carried the same thing underneath it, uncertainty. I answered calmly, briefly. Gave no details. By mid-morning, the confidence they'd arrived with had thinned. It was still there, but it was working harder now, trying to hold shape. My son checked his phone more than usual, stepped outside to take a call. He came back quieter. His wife watched more closely, not tense, just alert. Something was off and they could feel it. At one point she asked directly, "This appointment, it's not about anything important, is it?" Her tone was light, careful. I smiled. "It's important to me." That was all I said. The rest of the morning moved slowly. Plans were half made, then paused. Conversations started, then drifted. No one seemed quite sure what came next. That's what happens when assumptions lose their footing. After lunch, I gathered my things, nothing dramatic, no folders in hand, no announcements, just keys and a jacket, the same ones I'd set down the morning of the airport. Before I left, my son spoke up. "Everything's okay, right?" This time he didn't sound confident. I met his eyes again. Same calm, same tone, of course, still true. The drive was quiet, familiar roads, no urgency. I arrived on time and went inside without looking back. When I returned later that afternoon, the house felt different, not louder, quieter. They were both in the living room, waiting. That told me everything. They'd been talking while I was gone. Comparing notes, filling in gaps, trying to piece together what they didn't have access to anymore. I sat down across from them. No one spoke at first, then my son cleared his throat. "So, what was the appointment about?" I took a breath. Not to prepare myself, but to slow the moment down. "This," I said, tapping the folder I'd set on the table, "is just something that should have been clear a long time ago." His wife leaned forward slightly, not defensive, just focused. The confidence she'd arrived with was gone now, replaced by attention. I didn't explain anything yet. I didn't need to, because the shift had already happened. They could feel it. And for the first time since that morning text, the momentum wasn't carrying them forward anymore. It was waiting on me. I didn't rush, that mattered. I opened the folder slowly and placed it on the table between us, not like evidence, not like a threat, just like something overdue. Paper has a way of changing conversations without raising its voice. My son leaned forward first. His wife followed a second later, both of them quieter than I'd ever seen them in this house. I slid one document out and turned it so they could read it. No speeches, no build-up, just facts. "This is current," I said, "not old, not outdated." They didn't interrupt. That told me they already knew this wasn't going to go the way they'd expected. I pointed to a section, then another: ownership, authority, boundaries. Things that don't bend based on tone or intention. Things that don't care how confident you sound when you assume them. My son's expression changed first, not anger, confusion. He read the same line twice, like I had that morning with the text. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. His wife stayed still, eyes moving quickly across the page, already processing what this meant. "So," he started, then stopped. I didn't fill the silence for him. Silence does more work than explanation ever could. "I thought," he said, then shook his head. I mean, we assumed, I know, I said calmly. That's why we're looking at this now. No accusation, no blame, just acknowledgement. His wife finally spoke. Her voice was steady, but it didn't carry the same certainty it had before. This changes things. Yes, I said. It does. Another pause. The room felt smaller somehow, not tense, just focused. Every assumption that had floated comfortably in the background now had nowhere to sit. My son leaned back in his chair and rubbed his hands together slowly. "Why didn't you say something earlier?" he asked. It wasn't a challenge, it was genuine. I thought about that for a moment before answering. "Because no one asked," I said, "and because I didn't realize silence was being taken as permission." That landed. Harder than any raised voice could have. No one argued with the paperwork. They couldn't. It was clear, documented, quietly definitive. We went through it piece by piece, not every detail, just enough to remove doubt. Just enough to reset the frame they'd been operating in. Access wasn't automatic. Plans weren't assumed. Nothing moved forward without conversation. When we were done, the folder closed softly. No dramatic snap, no final gesture. Just an end. The house felt still again, like it had taken a breath it hadn't realized it was holding. My son looked up at me, and for the first time since they arrived, he didn't sound certain of anything. "So what happens now?" I didn't answer right away, because what happened next wasn't about punishment, it was about recalibration, and that was going to take more than confidence. It was going to take humility, something that doesn't show up until assumptions fall apart. I leaned back slightly and met his eyes. "Now," I said, "we slow things down," and judging by the look on their faces, they were finally ready to listen. Slowing things down felt unfamiliar to them. I could tell they were used to momentum, decisions stacking on top of each other, one plan leading cleanly into the next. This pause didn't fit that rhythm. We sat there for a while after I said it. No one rushed to fill the space. My son was the first to speak again, but his voice sounded different now. Lower, less certain. "So, what does slowing down actually mean?" It was a fair question. I folded my hands on the table and answered without changing my tone. "It means nothing moves forward just because it was assumed. It means conversations happen before plans. And it means this house isn't treated like a backup plan or a guarantee." His wife nodded slowly, not in agreement, in understanding. That was new. "I didn't realize we were doing that," she said. I believed her. Assumptions don't usually feel aggressive to the people making them. They feel logical, efficient, invisible. "I know," I said. "That's why this conversation matters now instead of later." My son looked down at the table. "I didn't think that text would land the way it did," he admitted. I let that sit. "I didn't respond because I needed time to see what it meant," I said, "and it meant more than the airport." That was the closest I came to addressing it directly. No accusation, just cause and effect. The realization crept in slowly after that, not all at once, not dramatically. They started asking different questions, not when things would happen, but if. Not how things would work, but whether they should. The confidence they'd arrived with didn't vanish. It reorganized, and in its place was something quieter, something more careful, respect. That doesn't show up when people feel entitled. It shows up when they realize the ground they were standing on isn't theirs to claim. We talked about boundaries, about timelines, about expectations that needed to be reset before they turned into resentments no one wanted to own later. No voices were raised, no one walked away, but something important changed. The house stopped being a silent assumption and became what it had always been, mine, and shared only by invitation. Later that evening, after the conversation had ended and the folder was back where it belonged, my son came to me alone. "I should have handled that differently," he said. "The text, all of it." I nodded. "I know." That was enough. Apologies don't always need witnesses, they just need to be real. That night the house felt different again. Not tense, not awkward, just honest. The noise had settled, the uncertainty had a name now. And clarity, real clarity, has a calming effect once it finally arrives. What surprised me most wasn't that things had changed. It was how quiet the house felt afterward. Not awkward, not heavy, just settled. They went to bed earlier than usual that night. No more planning, no more talking things through. I stayed up a little longer, sitting in the same chair I always used, listening to the familiar sounds of the house. Nothing felt rushed anymore. But I could tell something else was starting to sink in for them, not all at once, just slowly. The kind of realization that doesn't announce itself, it waits, it shows up later in small questions and careful pauses. I didn't push it. Some things land better when you give them time. And by the way things felt that night, I knew the conversation wasn't over yet. It just wasn't loud anymore. The next few days moved differently, not slower exactly, just with fewer assumptions attached to them. Mornings were quieter, not tense, just deliberate. Conversations stayed practical. Who was heading out, who'd be back later. Simple things asked instead of assumed, that stood out to me. My son checked in before making plans, not every time, but enough that I noticed the effort. His wife did the same. She asked questions now, small ones, the kind that show awareness. "Would this be okay? Does that work for you?" Nothing dramatic, just a shift in posture. The house responded to that. It felt like it belonged to itself again, not pulled in different directions by unspoken expectations. Not stretched thin by futures that hadn't been agreed on. One afternoon, I watched them load the car to head out for a few hours. No rushing, no commentary about space or timing, just movement, normal. Before leaving, my son stopped by the door. "We won't be late," he said, then paused. "But if we are, I'll let you know." I nodded. "That's fine." It wasn't the words that mattered, it was the pause before them. That evening, I cooked dinner for myself, nothing elaborate, something I'd made 100 times before. I ate at the table alone and didn't mind it. I realized then how much energy I'd spent over the months before managing quiet discomfort. Letting things slide, making room, telling myself it was temporary. It takes effort to stay silent for too long, and it takes relief to stop. When they came back later, they were lighter. Not because things were fixed, but because they were clearer. Uncertainty is heavier than truth, even when the truth isn't what you expected. We sat together for a bit, talked about nothing important, a show they'd watched, a place they'd driven past. Normal conversation without subtext pulling at it. At one point, his wife mentioned future plans again. Carefully this time, framed as an idea, not a conclusion. I listened, asked a question, offered a thought. That was it. No tension followed. Later that night, after they'd gone to bed, I walked through the house and turned off the lights like I always did. Same routine, same steps, everything felt intact, not because I'd taken something away, but because I'd finally stopped letting things be taken for granted. That difference matters. The next morning, my son brought up the airport, not defensively, not emotionally. "I should have said it differently," he said. "Or talk to you first." I nodded again. "I know. We didn't unpack it further. We didn't need to. Some acknowledgments don't improve with repetition." As the days passed, I could see it settling in for them. The understanding that things were going to move forward, just not on autopilot anymore. Boundaries have a way of doing that. They don't punish, they don't lecture, they simply change the shape of what comes next. And by the time they started talking about leaving, it was clear something had been reset. Not broken, reset. The house would be quiet again soon, but this time the quiet felt earned. The morning they left felt lighter than the one they arrived. No tension hanging in the air, no last-minute plans, just bags by the door and the normal rhythm of people getting ready to move on. My son hugged me before stepping outside. It wasn't rushed, it wasn't awkward, just real. "We'll talk soon," he said. "I know," I replied. His wife thanked me for everything, not just for the stay, for the conversation. She didn't say it directly, but it was there in the pause before she spoke, in the way she met my eyes. When the car pulled away, the house settled back into itself. Same walls, same furniture, same quiet. I walked through the rooms slowly, turning off lights that didn't need to be on, straightened a chair, set a cup in the sink, ordinary things. That's when I thought back to the text. "Don't come to the airport, my wife wants just family." I realized something then. The most important thing I did that day wasn't staying home. It wasn't the call, it wasn't the paperwork, it was not reacting. I didn't argue, I didn't explain myself. I didn't chase clarity from people who hadn't offered it. I let the moment show me what it meant. And then I handled what I was responsible for quietly, directly, and without turning it into a fight. By the afternoon of that same day, everything that needed to be clear was already clear. Not emotionally, legally, practically, permanently. So when they showed up later, there was no showdown waiting for them, just reality. That's the part people don't always expect. Karma doesn't always slam doors or raise its voice. Sometimes it just rearranges things while everyone else is busy assuming nothing will change. If you're watching this and you've ever been put in a position where staying quiet felt like the only way to keep your dignity, I'd really like to hear from you. Drop a comment, even just a few words about what hit home for you. And if you're still here at the end, go ahead and like the video. It helps these stories reach the people who need them. Subscribing just means you won't miss the next one, no pressure, just familiar ground. Before you go, there's another story on the end screen that connects closely to this one. It's about a moment where silence looked like weakness until it turned out to be the strongest move in the room. Different situation, same lesson. If this story made you think, that one takes it a step deeper. Click it when you're ready. The house is quiet again now, and this time it feels exactly the way it should.